The 1943 Ford GPA was not a celebrated weapon of war. It was not fast, not powerful, and not particularly loved by the soldiers who used it. The men who operated it had complaints. The engineers who evaluated it had doubts. And yet, more than 12,000 were built. They served on virtually every major front of the Second World War, and one of them eventually circumnavigated the entire planet. That is not the story of a failure. That is something far more complicated. The origins of the GPA trace back to 1941, when the United States Motor Transport Board established a project to develop a light amphibious vehicle capable of ferrying troops and cargo from offshore ships across beaches and continuing inland under its own power. The concept was straightforward. The execution was not. Roderick Stevens Jr., a yacht designer from Sparkman and Stevens, was brought in to shape the hull. His brief called for a vehicle weighing no more than 2,700 pounds. What eventually rolled off the production line weighed closer to 3,500. That gap between intention and reality would define everything that followed. Two companies competed for the contract. Marmon-Herrington built their prototype as an integrated unibody structure, welding steel sheet into a single hull. Ford took a different approach, using a conventional chassis and internal frame with sheet steel welded over it. The Ford design came in roughly 400 pounds lighter than its competitor and shared as many components as possible with the standard Willys MB and Ford GPW Jeeps already in production. Commonality of parts was a military priority. Ford won the contract and began production in 1942. The GPA was powered by an inline four-cylinder engine producing approximately 60 horsepower. It had four-wheel drive, a three-speed transmission, and a two-speed transfer case. A power takeoff drove a rear-mounted propeller housed in a dedicated tunnel faired into the bodywork, and a proper rudder provided directional control on water. The driver's compartment contained nearly twice as many control levers as a standard Jeep, managing two-wheel and four-wheel drive, high and low range, a capstan winch mounted at the bow, propeller deployment, and rudder control. For a vehicle derived from a simple utility Jeep, it had become remarkably complex to operate. In the water, the problems became immediately apparent. The production vehicle had grown far heavier than the original specification without a corresponding increase in hull volume. This gave the GPA dangerously low freeboard, meaning the distance between the waterline and the top of the hull was too small to handle anything beyond calm conditions. Open water, even with a light chop, could swamp it. The mission of ferrying troops and cargo from ships offshore through surf and onto beaches was precisely the condition the vehicle could least handle. In that core requirement, it failed. On land, the situation was little better. Soldiers found the GPA too heavy and its body too wide and unwieldy for practical use. In shallow water crossings where a standard Willys MB could simply drive through, the GPA would frequently become stuck. The U.S. Army issued a bulletin in 1944 explaining how axles could be salvaged from unwanted GPAs and used to repair standard Jeeps. That document is perhaps the most honest official assessment the vehicle ever received. Production was halted in March 1943 after just 12,778 vehicles, driven by a combination of poor field reception and financial disputes between Ford and the United States government. The vehicle had been in production for barely a year. And yet, the GPA did not disappear. It served in North Africa, Sicily, the Pacific Theater, and from the Normandy landings through to the end of the war in Europe. Under the Lend-Lease program, 4,486 GPAs were distributed to Allied nations. The Soviet Union received 3,520 of them, the largest single recipient. The Soviets were satisfied enough with the results that after the war they developed their own derivative, the Gaz-46, which entered production in 1952 and was exported across Soviet-aligned countries. After the war, surplus GPAs found their way into civilian hands. Farmers, ranchers, and adventurers purchased them and discovered that whatever limitations the military had found, the GPA was an extraordinarily capable machine for those willing to work within its constraints. The most remarkable post-war story belongs to Australian Ben Carlin, who modified a surplus GPA he named Half-Safe, and between 1950 and 1958 completed the first and only circumnavigation of the world by amphibious vehicle, crossing the Atlantic, driving across Europe, Asia, and eventually returning to complete the circuit. Guinness World Records recognizes the achievement to this day. A vehicle the U.S. Army considered barely worth repairing had crossed every ocean and continent on Earth. By the 21st century, approximately 200 of the original 12,778 GPAs were known to survive. Well-preserved examples have sold at auction for $125,000 or more. They appear in military vehicle shows, in museum collections, and occasionally still in the water, doing exactly what they were designed to more than 80 years ago. The Ford GPA was never the vehicle anyone wanted it to be. It was too heavy for the surf, too awkward for the roads, and too limited for the mission it was given. But it was present. It crossed rivers, supplied troops, and outlasted every criticism leveled against it. And in the hands of people stubborn enough to see its potential, it went further than any military planner ever imagined. That is perhaps the most honest definition of usefulness that exists. If you find value in stories about machines that defied their reputations, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next deep dive into vehicles history forgot to celebrate.